In this video, I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step process in building a PC in 2020. I'll be going through the build process from scratch, starting with the bare bone case and ending with the OS install. What's an OS? Don't worry if you're completely new to this. I'll be explaining what these terms mean. And be sure to watch until the end to find out what mistakes I made and how you can avoid them. Now, before you decide to build a PC, you need to answer two questions. One, what am I going to use this PC for? And two, what is my budget? Now, as far as budget, I knew I would be spending between $3,000 and $4,000 on the system I had in mind, and I was a little flexible with that as long as I got value out of it and provided me a smooth 4K editing experience. While I handpicked the parts for this build to be a high-end editing PC, it's also a beast when it comes to gaming. No, not that beast. I'm talking about this beast. And this beast. I'm an occasional gamer and I don't play competitively, but if the main purpose of this PC was for gaming, I would have done a couple of things differently. The first thing you want to do is head over to PCPartPicker.com. This website lets you add all the components of your build to make sure that the different parts are compatible with each other. Some of those incompatibilities could be related to architecture issues such as having a motherboard that doesn't support a certain type of CPU and vice versa. It can even be a physical incompatibility, such as buying RAM modules that are too tall where you can't put a fan on the CPU as the RAM modules will get in the way. Don't worry if you didn't catch what these terms mean. I'll be explaining all the details in the video. I recommend that you start with the CPU and work your way from there, because that will determine the type of cooling needed and the case to accommodate that cooling system. Let's begin the build process. There's no right or wrong way of what part to start with when building a PC, but there may be some ways more efficient and safer than others. For example, some people may choose to install the motherboard in the case and then attach the CPU, RAM sticks, and everything else. What you want to do is start with the motherboard by placing it on a flat surface or on the box that it came in with, and then start installing the CPU, RAM sticks, and NVMe drives if you have any. This way, you have plenty of room to work with. So let's start by installing the CPU. Unlock the latch to lift up the cover and remove the plastic piece that pops out. You want to make sure you align the arrow on the socket with the arrow on the CPU for a perfect fit. If you try it any other way, you will damage the pins on the CPU. So insert the CPU and lock the latch in place. You might feel like you're about to break something, as you will feel resistance when doing this part. It's okay, go ahead and push down hard to lock it in place. Just be sure those arrows are aligned. Wait. You're probably saying to yourself, this guy's not even wearing an anti-static wrist strap when handling PC parts. For those who don't know, an anti-static wrist strap is something you wear on your wrist, hence the name, to eliminate static electricity so you don't damage the circuitry of the components you'll be handling. This is something I recommend you get, especially if you're doing this for the first time. I didn't use one, and I've used the living daylight out of these parts while filming without any issues. Today's electronics are very well made, and unlike those made back in the 80s and 90s, minor static shocks are not a big deal. I totally just made up that last part, but I'm pretty sure it's true. Let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, if you decide not to use one, just don't drag your feet walking on carpet and then touch these components immediately after that. To be sure static is eliminated, what you need to do is touch something that's metal right before you handle any of these components in case there's any buildup, and you'll be fine. Alright, back to the build. As I said before, I won't be using any mechanical hard drives or standard SSDs for this build. I will only be using NVMe SSDs, connecting them to the PCI interface on the motherboard. This type of drive is an SSD on steroids. A regular mechanical hard drive is slow and a standard SSD is faster. But they both use the SATA interface. M.2 NVMe drives use the PCIe interface, offering significantly faster speeds. If you plan on using this type of storage, just make sure there are available slots on the motherboard. Begin by unscrewing the thermal guards on top. These drives tend to get hot, and the thermal guards help with that, acting as a heat sink. The M.2 standard allows these modules to be of different sizes. The dimension of this Samsung NVMe is 2280. That's 22 millimeters wide and 80 millimeters long. Depending on the size you have, they're marked on the motherboard. So insert the module in the slot at a 30-degree angle. You will hear a click once it's correctly inserted. Once you do that, it will be slanted and hanging off, and when you press it down, it will spring back up, staying in that position, and that's all normal. It will be in that position until you screw it in the standoff. Now screw back in the thermal guard and you're all done. I will speed up the video here installing the other two drives I have which follow the same exact steps. Now let's install the RAM modules. I got me some bling bling RAM modules. These are the G-Skill Trident Z Royale. I know they look fancy, even more fancy with the RGB. There are 4 slots on the motherboard and I have 4 sticks of 16 gigabytes each, so I will utilize all 4 slots. First, unlock the latches in the slots by pushing them outward. When inserting RAM modules, make sure you align the notch on the stick with that on the slot. The notches are not centered, and if you try to insert them any other way, it just won't work and you will damage them. So align them and make sure you push them all the way in until you hear a click and the latches automatically lock up on both ends. Now is the time to install the motherboard. I didn't have to do this, but you want to make sure to screw in the standoffs if they're not already screwed in your case. You put those in so the motherboard is raised when installed and it's not directly touching the case chassis. The side of the motherboard where all of the ports are located, covered by an I/O shield or plate, needs to be aligned with the designated opening in the back of the case. If your motherboard doesn't have an I/O shield already attached like mine, you want to be sure to install it in case, before you install the motherboard. Finally, screw in place the motherboard with the provided screws and you're all set. This case came with 3 fans pre-installed, and they're not the cheap fans that usually a lot of cases come with. There are 2 200mm fans in the front and 140mm fan in the back. There are a lot of high-end components in this PC that generate a lot of heat, so I wanted to match the front fans and have 2 200mm fans up on the top of the case, that is, to further help with the cooling. I want them positioned like the front ones, bringing in cooler air inside the case. I plan on moving these fans around and repositioning them to do some testing to find out the most optimal way to keep things cool in here. Just screw them in place and you're all set. In addition to the case fans, we need to keep the main component of a PC, the CPU, cool so it doesn't overheat, as it's the one doing most of the work. There are several ways of preventing a CPU from overheating. You can accomplish this by installing a fan with a heatsink on top of the CPU, an AIO liquid pump with a radiator and fans, or custom loop liquid cooling. The last one is unnecessary and is only done by PC enthusiasts. Now for this build, even though I think the fan with the heatsink would do the job to keep my i9-9900K CPU cool, I opted for the middle ground by going with the AIO liquid pump. The way this works is that the pump header acts as a heatsink, pumping the liquid from one tube, taking out the heat generated by the CPU, and then circulating it through a radiator with fans on top, dissipating the heat, and then the cooler liquid goes through the other tube, passes back to the CPU, and the cycle repeats. The first step is to install the bracket on the back side of the motherboard, which is the back of the case at this point. This is where the pump will be screwed in on top of the CPU. Apply the double-sided 3M tape provided to both edges and then line it up with the holes in the back of the motherboard and just push in. I plan on placing the radiator here in this area. Depending on the case you have, you want to make sure you're able to place the radiator a distance close enough for the pump to reach the CPU. So scope it out before you screw it in place. Once you decide on a spot, you can now install the fans on the radiator. You want to make sure you install the fans on top before placing it in the case so you have room to work with. I could have done it either way because there's plenty of room to work inside this case. Start screwing in the fans on top of the radiator. In this setup, the fans will be taking in fresh air from the front and the top 200 millimeter case fans, passing it through the radiator, cooling, and it pushing the hot air out the back of the case. At least this is what I hope to happen. Like I said, I'll be testing different variations of fan placements to see what's most optimal. At this point, you can screw in the radiator in place. Next, we're ready to attach the pump on the CPU, but before that, let's add the standoffs locking in the bracket we attached to the back of the motherboard earlier. The pump already has adhesive thermal paste on it. Most pumps do, but I like to use my own. So I have thermal paste that will be adding on the CPU, which I'll do later. So I'm just gonna wipe this off for now. Next, attach the brackets on the pump so it locks on the 4 screws we put in place around the CPU a few seconds ago. You want to insert it and twist it so the teeth of the bracket latch in place. Now I'm going to apply the thermal paste on the CPU using the dot method, which is just a small amount in the center. Don't spread it on the CPU. Let the pressure do that when you attach the pump. Finally, attach the pump and align it with the standoffs placed earlier around the CPU, and screw in the big thumb screws in a crisscross fashion. Hey, just a quick pause. If you're getting value out of this video, do me a favor and hit the thumbs up like button. It helps feed the YouTube algorithm for the growth of this channel, so smash that like button. Now we move on to install the PSU. This is where I made a huge mistake, but I got lucky. When I tried to insert the PSU block into its bay, I realized I couldn't slide it in there as the radiator was in the way. I tried to insert it through the back. The opening was too small and it didn't look like I could remove that piece. Luckily, with this case, the PSU shroud is detachable. I removed it and placed the PSU in its place without any issues. Trying to think ahead a little when building a PC so you don't end up having to uninstall a part to install another. I went ahead and connected the power cables into the power supply and fed them into the back of the case so I could reroute them closer to their respective ports. This is the 24-pin motherboard cable, the CPU cable, and the fan controller's cable. Then you put the shroud back in its place. Next, I will attach the power cables coming from the PSU to power the motherboard and the CPU. We start with the main 24-pin motherboard cable. Since I rerouted this cable to the back of the case coming out of the power supply, I just bring it into the front near the closest opening. This only goes in one way, so don't fight it too much if it's not clicking in. You also need to plug in the power cable for the CPU, which is located at the very top left of the motherboard. Next, I have 2 cables coming out of the CPU cooler block that need to be plugged in. First, I will plug in one of the cables into the CPU fan connection on the motherboard. Even though I'm not using a fan in this build, this cable needs to be plugged in. Otherwise, you'll get an error message when you boot up and it will shut down. I'm just going to loop it around the RAM modules to give it a cleaner look. The second cable is the cable that controls the LED on the block. The cable header looks like a USB. Do not plug this into the motherboard. This needs to be plugged into one of the fan controllers in the back of the case. The next thing I want to tackle is feeding all the fan cables to the back of the case. Remember, these cables do not get plugged into the motherboard. They get plugged into the Thermaltake controllers. Now the front looks much cleaner, but the back side not so much. I will handle all of that when I plug in everything and deal with the cable management later. I'm just going to separate them for now so I could easily figure out what these cables are. The case cables are cables that came installed in the case, which will plug into the motherboard. This one here is the audio cable. I just feed it in through the openings in the case to the front and snake it inside the PSU shroud and plug it into the port marked audio on the very bottom left of the motherboard. The next cable coming out of the back of the case is the one with the various LED and PC power cables. This is actually one cable that splits into multiple cables. You can directly plug those into the motherboard one by one, or use a connector to group them together before you actually plug them in. So this way you can just plug them all at once, minimizing any damage you may cause to the pins on the motherboard, and it makes it a lot easier to plug in as well. This is going to go in the very bottom left of the motherboard. I'll just route it through the PSU shroud to hide it and then plug it in. The next cable will be the USB 2.0 cable, which again will be routed through the back of the case to the front, and it will go into either one of the ports labeled USB on the motherboard. The last cable coming out of the case is a USB 3.0. The header is bigger than the standard USB 2.0 one. I'm just gonna bring it in from the back of the case and plug it into the motherboard. You will need to refer to your motherboard's manual to see where all the connections are. Taking a look at the back of the case, things are starting to look cleaner and tidy for now. Now I'm going to connect the cables to all the fans. There are a total of 8 fan cables that need to be connected here in this build. Remember, those cables don't plug in directly on the motherboard, as they look like USB headers, but they're not. You connect them to the Thermaltake controllers, which I plan on putting in this area here. We'll see where the best place to put these in the back of the case. I will do a separate video on the Thermaltake cooler and controllers, but basically I have 2 controllers here, one that came with the case and one that came with the CPU cooler. You can connect up to 5 fans to each controller. These controllers need to be connected together using a micro USB cable, and each controller needs to be powered through a Molex cable to the PSU. One of the controllers will act as the main controller, which needs to be connected to the motherboard using a USB cable. To indicate which controller will be the main one, you need to refer to the CPU cooler manual to determine which position the dip switches need to be in. So I connected the controllers together using a micro USB cable on one end and a USB-like cable on the other. I was planning on attaching the controllers in this area here, but I realized I don't want to block the airflow to the radiator, so I'll have to find a new place for them. They do come with the double-sided 3M Velcro tape, which I will use. I'll start with plugging in the Molex power cables, which need to be connected to the PSU. As I was trying to plug in all of the cables, the controllers kept falling off, so I decided I'm just gonna tuck them in somewhere in the back. Now I have both Molex power cables plugged in to both controllers. I can start plugging in the cables for the 8 fans. I'll speed up this repetitive process to connect all the fans. So now we have this mess, and I'm glad I have a huge case with plenty of room in the back of this case to hide all of these cables. Now I will use a fork as an extension to plug in both ends of the Molex power cables coming out of the controllers to feed it to the PSU. I don't know why Thermaltake decided to incorporate Molex cables, as these cables are outdated and kind of obsolete now. This last cable is the one coming out of the controllers via micro USB. That's gonna get plugged into the USB 2.0 connection on the motherboard. The last piece of the puzzle here is to install the graphics card, which will sit in one of the PCI slots on the motherboard. This is the NVIDIA RTX 2080 Super GPU customized by EVGA. Anyway, you can install the GPU either vertically or horizontally. I will do it horizontally for now, but I'll do a video on installing this vertically. This is a simple and quick step, as all you need is to remove the brackets in the backside to allow room for installation. Depending on the size of your graphics card, you need to remove 1, 2, or 3 pieces. I had to remove 3 due to the size of the GPU, as it's pretty thick. I realized that I didn't remove the SSD bracket here since I'm not using the standard SSD drives, but I'll leave it in for now, but we'll probably remove it later to help with the airflow, since it's kind of blocking the GPU fans. Finally, attach the power cables onto the GPU and you're all set. Remember the CPU fan cable that I installed earlier? I was going over the motherboard manual to make sure I didn't mess anything up. I had it in this location before and it needs to go here, so I'll just route the cable along the RAM modules and connect it. Taking a look at everything, I'm proud of myself, as this looks like a clean build. Not so much in the backside though, as I still have take care of cable management. Before you do that though, I recommend that you test it out by turning it on to make sure that power is up. You don't want to be in a situation where you tie down the cables, close the case panels, and then realize that there's some kind of cable that you forgot to plug in or something like that. Just hit the power button to power on the case, and we have liftoff. This PC will boot up to your BIOS settings, as we don't have an OS installed yet. Confirm that the information is correct. For example, make sure all RAM modules are showing up in case you didn't fully push down one of them. After you make sure the machine powers up to the BIOS setup, turn it back off. At this point, you could handle the cable management in the back side of the case. Depending on the size and type of case you have, this part could be a fairly quick process, or you could be spending an extra hour or two trying to hide and tie down all the cables to make it look pretty. Once you take care of the cable management and wipe down the case, you need to install the operating system. For this build, I chose to install Microsoft Windows 10 Pro. An operating system is a software that interacts with the hardware you just installed and provides an environment in which you can work in. Think about your car's hardware, how you can interact with it by utilizing the dashboard and the steering wheel buttons. And so the operating system is kind of like that dashboard. It's kind of like a middleman between your application needs and the hardware. I wasn't sure if I needed the Pro version, as it's twice the cost of the Home Edition, but decided to opt for the Pro as it has more features like disk encryption. The OS install process is fairly easy. Just plug in the USB thumb drive that the install files are on into a USB port and power on the PC, and it will walk you through the process of that install. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you got value out of it, go ahead and click the like button. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified of any new content I put out. Let me know in the comment section below if you have any questions or suggestions. Also, let me know what you use your computer for. And if you had a healthy budget, what would your dream build be like? I'll check you up later.